Now, some of her other friends from the Red Cross had gone to San Francisco. They felt San Francisco was an open, welcoming place, and they could start their lives over again. And they invited my mother to join them, so she did. She left New York, went to San Francisco. These crazy ladies got a houseboat in Sausalito, and they lived together in this eccentric houseboat. Which is funny to me, because knowing my mother's Victorian ways, you know, it makes her sound like a hippie, which I think she would have been appalled by, but she was finding her new life. Now my dad, meantime, is in the Mexican military, and the Mexican government is sending him to the US to do trade and business and arrange things. So they sent him to San Francisco. Now he was a musician, and he loved swing music. He loved big band jazz and swing. And he would come to the US every chance he got to buy 78s. Which is, you can imagine nowadays, a really difficult concept for my children to get. They're not quite sure what's a 78, but he bought them. He loved them. And on his trip to San Francisco, the Mexican consulate decided to throw a party for the Army officers who came. And they called around looking for handsome women, as they did in those days, and they called the department store where my mother worked, which was I. Magnan's department store. She was a jewelry buyer. And these women went to socialize. They could have a dance and, you know, enjoy vino or whatever. There was my mother posing, I'm sure. And she would tell this story that at the party there was a movie actor from Argentina. And this movie actor apparently, according to her, said terrible things to her in Spanish, which I think is really curious because I realized she never learned Spanish. She had no idea what he was saying. And it might have been quite lovely for all I know. Maybe he was reciting poems, but to her, it was bad, whatever. And you know how our stories mutate. I'm sure you have a favorite story that you've told 200 times. I certainly do. I tell these stories over and over again until my kids start mocking me, and I realize I have become my own grandparents already. But you know, the thing about that information is that it's sacred. And I didn't realize it when my elders were telling me stuff over and over, because I was like, oh my God, please don't tell me that again. Because now they're gone, and I've lost the details. I can't remember exactly what they said. And I should have paid attention. And I realized that my family was always trying to pass on something holy. This is part of my life. This is part of your history. Hold on to it. And I wasn't careful enough with it, which is one of the reasons I think I'm a writer now. Because I want to be more careful with these stories people give us. But the story changed. And I remember when I was a kid, it was cool enough that an Argentine movie actor was pursuing my mom. I thought, pretty cool, you know. She was, again, just my mom until she showed me pictures of herself, and I realized she looked like, you know, Merle Oberon or someone from that day, just gorgeous. And I thought, wow, wow. No wonder this guy was chasing her. And the story went from Argentine movie star to then Argentine movie star with a mustache. You know, which he twitched a little bit. And then, a couple of years later, it got kind of long, and then he twirled it. And he said bad things to her. And by the end of her life, the story had changed so much that he seemed to have had a cape. Look at her, laws say some terrible thing. So my mom is trying to get away from this guy. She's going through the party, and he's in hot pursuit, kind of like Dracula or something. And she goes out into the courtyard, which is an enclosed courtyard. She can't get back in the party, and she's in a corner, and here he comes. Saying terrible things to her and approaching. And that's the moment when my dad, looking like Errol Flynn, or at least in his mind, you know, red-headed, blue-eyed, rosy-cheeked Mexican captain, rushes out of the party in his uniform, and there's a big dramatic scene, some version of, in Spanish, unhand her, you varlet. And apparently the Argentine, in shock, flees out of the courtyard. And I heard this story my whole life, and it was only till when I grew up that I realized that I suspect my dad put this guy up to it. knowing macho men, you know, knowing how that can work, I like to think of him slipping the guy $5 and saying, you know, say some things and I'll chase you away. But my father, my mom was a sucker for a man in uniform, you know, captain with his medals, steps up to her and he tries out his rudimentary English on her, takes his captain's hat off, clicked his heels, bowed to her and said, "Would you like to dance with me?" And she said, "Oh, yes," you know, and off they went, fell in love. Now, the romance began, and my dad went back to San Francisco as much as possible on official business until, this won't surprise anyone, the Mexican government ordered him to kill somebody. They paid him a $2,000 check, American dollars, 1954, which he never even cashed. I still have the check. Never cashed. He wouldn't do it. And when he refused the order, then they put out a call for his termination. And so he had to get out of Mexico City. And he fled, which is how my father got to Tijuana. Before my father got to Tijuana, my grandfather, Urrea, and Grandma Murray had moved also to Tijuana, which is where my dad went to get into their house to hide out. Now, the reason they went, and maybe some of you are in the fraternity, I don't know, but my grandfather was a Mason. He was a Freemason and a Rosicrucian. And some of his lodge brothers, or whatever, I don't know their terminology, but some of his lodge mates, anyway, in the Mazatlan area, decided that what Tijuana needed was to clean up its act. And this was, you know, at the turn of the end 40s, late 40s, so it was already known as a bad place. And these Masonic brothers went to Tijuana to create an organic, multi-grain bread baking business to bring health food to the poor. And needless to say, they lost their shirts. Nobody in Tijuana cared about multi-grain bread. But he built the family home, which is still there, on a street called La Independencia, on a dirt street in the hills. And that's where my dad went. And when my dad romanced my mother and finally got her to agree to marry him, they got married in City Hall, and then he whisked her off to the dirt street in Tijuana, far from the hacienda she no doubt thought she was going to. And there she was, the only American in this poverty-stricken barrio, and then pregnant with me. I was born on the road to the dog track, which everybody always told me growing up, do not tell people you were born in Tijuana, it's shameful. But I realized people kind of like it. It adds a little something to the story. And I get to tour endlessly. I speak many times a year now. And I've been calling this my God Bless America tour. Because I have to tell you, if you're born on the road to the dog track in Tijuana, and you spend your first 5 years on a dirt street with no plumbing in Tijuana, and then you get to come to places like this and speak to nice people about the books you've published, only in America. I guarantee you, only in America. So my mother worked in San Diego. She worked at a department store. My father had a green card, and he came across the border and worked in a tuna cannery. He also was a bread truck driver delivering bread, oddly echoing my mom. You know, he delivered donuts as well. And then he became a custodian at bowling alleys, which is where he worked his entire life. And I kind of grew up in the backs of the big bowling alleys, climbing around the Brunswick machines and stuff. So when I was a little kid and I'd see the James Bond movies, then I'd climb in the machines with my plastic pistols and imaginary, you know, Smersh agents falling into the machinery. That was my playground. And my dad, you know, he wanted to, he loved Mexico. He didn't want to lose Mexico, but he also wanted to belong in the United States. And I think it was a lifelong struggle for him, a classic immigrant's struggle, I think, of trying to figure out how this country worked and how he could fit into it while not abandoning his roots. I think it drove him a little crazy. It was really hard for him. Our neighborhood was devastated by a plague of tuberculosis, and people died all around my grandma's house, and I ended up with it, which is why I came to the U.S. The only reason probably, finally, aside from my mother's loneliness, was the fact that I was dying of tuberculosis. And they realized if they didn't get me out of Tijuana, I would probably die. Which I think is echoed in a lot of people's journeys. You don't always hear about that, but the stakes are pretty high for a lot of people. So we came.